Good morning. So, it is a lovely day here in Sweden and it is a little bit chilly outside, but I shall persevere because the sun is shining and it's an absolutely beautiful day. And we are going to talk about integration tests, you and I. So, what is an integration test? See, the term for integration test is a little bit loose, and I think that to start us off so that you don't, misunderstand what I'm saying or that you think I'm using the wrong terms, I'll define some things. So to me, a unit test is a test that basically asserts one single thing about one single function. That's the smallest test that you can write for any piece of code that you write in any language. An integration test, to me, is when you create a higher level service or something like that, or an endpoint or something, anything that requires a sequence of events to take place in order to produce a certain value. To give you something more concrete, I think of an integration test as something as, let's say that you have a create user endpoint on your server. An integration test to me would be that you fire off a request, an HTTP request, to that endpoint, and you assert that the expected receiver, like I say that you have a user service that has a method called create user, you should be able to, in that test, to assert that when that request comes in, that's the code that's going to run. That is an integration test to me. And you can also call it I don't know, some people want to call it acceptance test, but I will talk about acceptance testing and what I think about, or rather how I think about acceptance testing. And the other part of integration testing is that you can actually test the service itself. Let's say that you have a very complex service that needs to do a lot of different things, like database accesses and create some state. Let's say you had a product service that needs to be able to basically have, I don't know, say that you need to be able to add a product to a user's gift basket or like it's of the user's cart. Well, the way that you would do something, in my opinion, in order to do an integration test for that is that you would stub or mock off the create user service, or rather like the user service get users function, whatever you have. Most likely you have something like getting a user from the service, so you stub and mock that off so you get some fake data up, and then you have you add user product to user or whatever function on the product service, and you add that in. I'm getting a bit off topic here, but the defining these things becomes a little bit important. And then you have an acceptance test or an end-to-end test where you actually test the interaction a user is going to have with your system. Flow to like the entire flow. So let's say that you have a web application. Let's say that you're creating some type of web page, and a acceptance test would be, let's say that you wanted to have a scenario for buying a product on your web page. Well, then you would have something like Selenium or a WebDriver or something like that that basically goes to your web page in a test environment, clicks a product, adds it to the basket, and clicks through the purchase flow, fills out all the forms and all that good stuff, and gets all the way to the end of that purchase flow. That is simulating an entire user's interaction with your web page. If you are making an API, for example, it would be something more trivial, more something like basically you can think of it in the same way. If you have a transaction API or something like that, it's basically spinning up the server and asserting through basically doing a series of calls to that API that everything worked as expected. That to me is an end-to-end test. Now, why am I talking to you about these things? Well, I'm talking to you about them because there are a lot of discussions back and forth as to testing and how to think about testing and when should you test, what should you test. All these different questions are still very much up in the air even now. And so I wanted to share a concrete example of two scenarios where where I think that testing makes a lot of sense, and where it's almost critical, because the thing is that a lot of people are willing to buy into the idea that unit testing is very important. Even the people who say that you shouldn't try to do unit testing 100%, like you get 100% coverage, and I can absolutely agree to that. Like having 100% unit test coverage is, if you can get it without a lot of cost, that's great, but it's very, very difficult to get. It's a utopian thing, but most people are willing to accept that this is a useful thing. And then you have people who will say that, integration testing, well, you may not need to do that all that much. And I'm actually here to try to convince you that you really should rethink that. There are absolutely situations where your application isn't all that complicated, and you don't need to create a integration test or an end-to-end test or simulate a user on your system. But there are situations where it's vital, and the two clear examples I can give you from my own personal experience when I believe that it is absolutely critical that you do that. The first and foremost, the strongest case I can give you is a personal project that I have, where basically it was a tool I created when I was working at Ticketmaster. And the idea of the tool was basically that it would parse, you give it a directory with SAS files, and it would basically go through all of these files and spit out a report showing how many colors you have, like how many mixins are you using, all different kinds of usage statistics, statically analyzing all of this, right? And the thing is, that is, in order for me, or rather, that project has a lot of unit tests, but it also has integration tests, and this is a CLI. So integration tests are a kind of loose, as I said, it's a loose concept. It doesn't have to do with a router, like a routing issue, like an endpoint or something like that. For a CLI, an integration test, at least the way that I have structured it, is to run the code against, a certain use case. And you see, because every issue that I have had, like where people have reported that there was an issue with the project had an issue, basically it couldn't parse a certain sequence of files, or one file was giving a false report, basically. The problem with having a system that is trying to dynamically analyze something like SAS files is that it's a very, very dynamic problem. Every single person who uses that tool is going to have a different project, a different file structure, different scenario. So in order for me to, in a sane way, make changes to the project and make sure that I, don't create any regression for some other person who's using the project, the only way I can actually do that is to ask the people who have been using it to provide me with their source files, and then I will add that directory into my test suite, and I will actually run the tool against their specific project and create a test that asserts that this is going to be with the expected output. And that's an iterative process. If you have that approach, that's not really unit testing. It's like you basically take an entire project and pipe it through to sit and look at the output. That is an integration test. And it's absolutely vital, because imagine if I fixed a case for one person and then I break it for another person. So that's a one really, really strong, great concrete example of it. Another one, which is even more critical, is that right now I'm working at a company where we're trying to solve a issue where we're basically trying to figure out, based on bank transactions, what is a subscription and what is a one-time card purchase. Now, you may not think that this is a big problem, but it is a very, very tricky problem to solve, because armed with only like a very small amount of information, such as dates and the amount and some description text on the transaction, we are supposed to figure out if you are, let's say that you have a gym membership, we need to figure out if you are like every purchase that you're making at that gym, if that is you using basically paying for a subscription, or if you're simply buying something at the shop. And most commonly, at least here in Sweden, there's no distinction, or there's there's virtually no way for us to make that distinction. So the problem we're trying to solve is basically guesswork. We're trying to guess whether or not this is a subscription plan. So as you can imagine, this is a non-deterministic problem that we're trying to solve. So the argument I made to my boss the other day, which is most likely the way we're going to approach solving this problem long term, is that as we get error and bug reports into the company from users where we have falsely or incorrectly identified a subscription for them, we simply take their use case, like their specific case with the transaction information they have, and add a test, an integration test in our suite of tests. Run our project against it with what we expect to be the output, and we solve for each case. Now you may think this is wasteful, but it's actually, in my opinion, the only sane way to solve this type of problem. And that's what this video is about. What I'm trying to tell you is that if you're trying to solve a very dynamic, very, very, how would I say, case-by-case type of problem, it's actually very beneficial for you to stop. Unit testing is great, but it's actually much more important that you have integration tests that you can apply to each case. That and I argue that your process should be more about, all right, you get a bug, you get an issue, ask the person who reported it to submit the data that you need in order to create a test case for their specific case. And then you solve it, and then you solve the next one, and the next one. Because odds are that that's the only way you're long-term going to be able to improve the quality of the system. That's at least from my experience. Hopefully this was useful to you.